I've always loved winter, but this story happened during a time that completely changed how I see it. I was 24 back then, living in a small town in northern Montana. Winters there hit hard, the kind that make the whole world feel frozen and empty. At the time, I worked at a hardware store and rented a tiny cabin a few miles outside town. I liked the quiet. I liked waking up to snow piled against the windows and the sound of nothing but wind outside. It felt peaceful, almost safe in its own way. That winter was different though. The snow came earlier than usual, heavier too, and for days the road to my cabin stayed buried. Most nights I didn't mind being stuck out there. I'd make coffee, sit by the window, and watch the snow swallow the trees. But around mid-December, I started noticing things that unsettled me. Little things at first, like strange patterns in the snow near my porch, or the feeling that someone had been standing close to my window while I slept. At the time, I told myself it was just the winter messing with my head. I had no idea it was only the beginning. At first, I honestly brushed everything off. Winter messes with your senses. Wind can sound like footsteps. Branches tapping the windows can feel like someone knocking. That's what I kept telling myself. But the odd things didn't stop. They got clearer. One night, after a long shift, I got home just before the sky went completely dark. Snow was falling hard, coming down sideways from the wind. As I walked toward the porch, I noticed something strange near the steps. There were footprints in the snow, fresh ones, but they didn't lead anywhere. It was like whoever made them walked right up to my porch and then vanished. No return prints. No drag marks. Just a straight path ending at my door. I stood there for a few seconds longer than I should have, the cold soaking through my jacket as my brain tried to make sense of it. Eventually, I convinced myself they had just been filled in by wind. Inside the cabin, things felt off too. Nothing dramatic, just subtle shifts that made me feel like the place wasn't empty when I left for work. A chair slightly pulled out. My keys were placed on the wrong hook. A blanket folded differently. Tiny things I wouldn't even notice if they weren't so specific. I started second-guessing my own memory, wondering if I was just rushing in the mornings and forgetting how I left things. But the feeling of being watched was the hardest to ignore. Some nights, while sitting by the window with a mug of coffee, I'd get this tightness in my chest, the kind you get when someone is staring at you from behind. I'd look out into the dark tree line and swear I saw movement. Something shifting between the branches, too smooth to be the wind. Once, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a person standing just beyond the reach of the porch light, completely still. I blinked, and it was gone. Maybe it was never really there. But the more these things happened, the more I felt the cabin tightening around me, like winter wasn't the only thing closing in. The night everything shifted from strange to dangerous started quietly. So quietly it felt wrong. No wind, no creaking trees, no distant crunch of snow shifting. Just a heavy stillness that made the air inside the cabin feel thick. I tried to distract myself by making dinner, but halfway through chopping vegetables, I heard something that froze me in place. It was a voice, faint, whispering, right outside my window. I couldn't make out the words, but it had the rhythm of someone talking low, like they were trying not to be heard. I stood there, knife in my hand, listening so hard my ears actually hurt. The whispering stopped the moment I moved. I forced myself to step toward the window, but before I got close, something tapped the glass. 2 slow taps, like knuckles. I fell backward. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it shook the floor. When I finally got the nerve to look outside, there was nothing but darkness and the faint glow from the porch light. No footprints. No shadow. Nothing. After that, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was standing at the foot of my bed. Around 3 in the morning, I finally cracked and turned on every light in the cabin. I paced around, checking the locks over and over. That's when I heard the next sound, soft crunching outside, like someone carefully walking in the snow. I killed the lights immediately and crouched near the window. At first, I didn't see anything, but then something moved near the tree line. It stepped forward, just enough for the porch light to hit it. A person, tall, hunched, wearing something dark over their head. They weren't walking. They were swaying, like shifting their weight from one foot to the other. Slowly, almost rhythmically. Then they turned toward the cabin. I ducked out of sight, my breath shaking. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like minutes. I didn't dare look again until everything went silent. When I finally checked the window, the figure was gone. But the footprints, they were leading right up to the porch again, stopping at the exact spot as before. This wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there, and they knew exactly where I lived. And now, they weren't hiding their presence anymore. They wanted me to know they were watching. 2 nights after seeing that figure, everything came to a breaking point. A storm had rolled in, one of the worst of the season, and the wind howled against the cabin so violently it felt like the walls were shaking. I tried to convince myself that whatever, or whoever, had been out there wouldn't show up in weather like this. But I was wrong. Around midnight, the power went out. The cabin fell into complete darkness. No hum from the heater, no lights, nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, but the beam was weak, flickering like it could die any second. The temperature inside was already dropping, and the storm outside made it clear that leaving wasn't an option. That's when the pounding started. At first it was a single hit, one loud, heavy thud against the front door. Then another, and another. Slow, deliberate, like someone testing the strength of the wood. I stood frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When the pounding stopped, I thought maybe they'd left. But then I heard the doorknob. It was turning. Someone was trying to come inside. I backed away, grabbing the only thing I had that could work as a weapon, a metal fireplace poker. The door rattled violently now, the frame groaning as whoever was outside threw their full weight against it. Snow from the storm blew in through the cracks, and I could hear heavy breathing on the other side. Not fast, not panicking, just steady and patient. I ran to the back window, thinking maybe I could slip out and make a run for it. But the moment I pulled the curtain aside, a face slammed against the glass. A pale face, lips pulled into a stretched, unnatural grin, eyes wide and unfocused, like they were staring through me instead of at me. I screamed and stumbled back. The figure outside began pounding on the window now, each hit cracking the glass more and more. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed my boots, shoved my feet into them, and kicked open the back door so hard I fell into the snow. I didn't look back. I just ran into the storm, into the dark trees, letting the wind swallow the sound of my footsteps as I escaped into the blizzard. I don't remember much about the run through the storm. I just remember the cold burning my lungs and the feeling that something was close behind me, even though I never heard footsteps. By some miracle, I reached the main road. A snowplow driver spotted me stumbling in the headlights and practically dragged me into the cab. I was shaking so hard I could barely talk, but I managed to get out enough for him to call the sheriff. When they searched my property the next morning, they found the cabin in ruins. The front door was nearly off its hinges. The back window was shattered. But the footprints in the snow were the worst part, because there were 2 sets. One was clearly mine, leading away from the cabin. The other stayed close behind them for almost half a mile before suddenly stopping, like the person had just stepped out of existence. They never found anyone. No suspects, no clues, nothing. I didn't go back to that cabin. I didn't even pack my things. I moved in with my brother for a while, and eventually out of Montana completely. I still think about that night every winter, especially when the wind sounds almost like whispering. I was 19 when this happened, during the coldest winter our town in northern Wisconsin had seen in almost 20 years. Back then, I was working part-time at a small lodge on the edge of a frozen lake. The place barely stayed open during winter, mostly because only a few stubborn ice fishermen and old couples ever bothered coming out that far. I didn't mind it, though. The lodge was quiet, the guests kept to themselves, and the snow-covered lake at night always looked peaceful in a lonely kind of way. For a little extra cash, I agreed to stay in the staff cabin behind the lodge whenever the manager was out of town. It wasn't much, just a single room with a heater that groaned louder than it worked, but I liked having a place to myself. Most nights, I'd close up the lobby around 10 p.m., walk the short path to the cabin, and fall asleep to the sound of the wind pushing against the frozen trees. But the week this happened, the lake didn't sound right at night. The cracks in the ice were louder than usual, sharp, echoing booms that felt too close, like something was moving underneath. And one night, I swear I heard something else mixed in with the cracking. Something that sounded almost human. At first, I blamed the noises on the lake itself. Anyone who's lived near a frozen lake knows that ice shifts and pops all night. But the sounds I was hearing didn't match the usual sharp cracks. They were slower, dragged out, almost like someone calling from far away, their voice buried under layers of ice. One night, after closing up the lodge, I stepped outside and immediately heard it again. A long, low moan echoing across the lake, carried by the wind. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that it made the hair on my arms stand up. I stood there for a minute, staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself it was just ice shifting. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded like someone trying to get my attention. Inside the cabin, little things started feeling strange too. My flashlight, which I always kept on the shelf near the bed, kept ending up on the floor. The window latch that I swore I closed every night would be halfway open in the morning. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired, forgetting things during long shifts. But then there were the footprints. 2 nights in a row, I found a single set of prints in the snow leading from the lake to the edge of the path near my cabin. Only one set, no return tracks, no sign of anyone walking away. Just a line of deep impressions coming straight from the frozen lake. I mentioned it to the lodge manager the next morning, trying to laugh it off, but he got strangely quiet. All he said was, "Don't go near the lake after dark. Ice plays tricks on people." That didn't help. If anything, it made the tension worse. Every night after that, the noises grew louder, the moaning deeper, the cracking sharper. I started keeping the curtains closed because I couldn't shake the feeling that if I looked out at the lake long enough, I'd see someone standing there. Someone is waiting. And every night, that voice under the ice sounded just a little closer. Things escalated fast after that. The noises coming from the lake weren't just occasional anymore. They happened every night, usually right after midnight. Sometimes it was that same long moan. Other times it sounded like muffled banging, like fists hitting something solid. The kind of noise a trapped person might make if they were pounding on a wall. One night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping across the outside of my cabin. Not an animal. This was slow and deliberate, sliding across the wood from one end of the wall to the other. I held my breath and listened. The scraping stopped right beneath my bedroom window, followed by a soft, hollow tapping. 3 taps. Then silence. I didn't sleep after that. The next evening, after closing the lodge, curiosity got the better of me. Instead of going straight to the cabin, I walked toward the lake. The air was painfully cold, every breath stinging my lungs, but the lake was quiet, too quiet. No cracking, no shifting ice, just a flat white surface stretching into darkness. Then I saw it. Near the center of the lake was a small, perfectly round hole in the ice. It was dark inside, like the lake had swallowed something whole. I stood there staring, convinced it hadn't been there the day before. Before I could move, a low groan drifted up from that direction. Not from the wind, from below. Deep, strained, and struggling. My legs went numb. I backed away slowly, my boots crunching in the snow. Right then, the ice near the hole shifted. Just a tiny movement, like something underneath was pressing upward. I ran. Back in the cabin, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. But the sounds didn't stop. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, just staring at the door. That's when I heard footsteps outside. Slow, steady, crunching through the snow, stopping right outside the cabin. I froze. The footsteps stayed there for a full minute. Then they circled around the cabin. Once. Twice. On the 3rd pass, they stopped directly under my window. It wasn't angry. Whispered my name. It sounded tired, desperate, like someone who'd been calling for help for a long, long time. I didn't look outside. I was too terrified to even breathe. But that was the moment I realized whatever was happening. It wasn't just strange sounds anymore. Something from that lake wanted me, and it knew where to find me. 2 nights later, everything finally broke. A blizzard swept in fast, the kind that makes the world disappear outside your window. I was stuck in the cabin alone, the wind slamming the walls hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling. Around 11 p.m., the power flickered twice, then died completely. The sudden silence from the heater made the whole place feel instantly colder. I grabbed my flashlight and backed into the corner of the room. I was already on edge, but what came next didn't feel real. A single, deafening crack echoed across the lake, deep and violent. It sounded like the ice had split open all at once. Then came the screaming. Not muffled anymore. Not distant or buried under ice. It was right outside. A choked, desperate scream, like someone drowning and calling out at the same time. Before I could move, something slammed into the cabin door. Once. Then again, harder. The whole frame rattled, as if someone was throwing their entire weight against it. Snow blew in through the tiny gaps around the windows, and the cabin felt like it was shrinking around me. The 3rd hit was so hard the chair I'd wedged under the handle jumped. I dropped the flashlight, and it rolled across the floor, spinning its weak beam across the room. That's when I saw the shadow under the door. Long fingers, too many of them, pressing against the gap at the bottom, curling upward as if they were trying to hook onto something. Then a voice right at the door. "Let me in, it's so cold." My legs moved before my brain did. I grabbed my boots, yanked them on without tying them, and lunged for the back window. The glass was thin from the cold. I shattered it with a single hit from the flashlight and climbed out into the snow. I didn't look back. I felt the cold crawl instantly into my clothes, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The wind howled, the snow hit my face like needles, and somewhere behind me, the screaming started again, louder, angrier, closer. I ran toward the lodge lights in the distance, praying I'd make it before whatever was behind me reached that broken window. I don't remember reaching the lodge's front door. 1 minute I was running through the storm, the next I was inside, collapsed on the wooden floor, barely able to speak. The night clerk, an older guy named Paul, kept asking what happened, but all I could say was, "Something's on the lake, someone's out there." He locked the doors, pulled the curtains shut, and sat with me until the sheriff arrived an hour later. When they checked the cabin the next morning, it looked like it had been hit by a truck. The front door was splintered, the hinges twisted. Snow was piled inside the room, and the back window was completely destroyed. But the strangest part was the footprints. The sheriff said there was only one set, mine, leading away from the cabin. None approach it, none circling it, nothing near the window. And on the lake, the hole I'd seen was gone, completely frozen over, smooth as glass. The sheriff told me the weather had warped my senses. Paul told me winter plays tricks, but I know what I heard. I know what touched the bottom of that door. I quit the lodge that same week and never stepped foot on that lake again. And sometimes on cold nights, when ice starts cracking, I still hear that voice, calling for someone to let it in. I was 21 when this happened, living in a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Maine. I had just started a seasonal job as a snowplow operator for a rural town, which meant early mornings, long shifts, and endless stretches of icy roads with nothing but trees and snow as far as the eye could see. The solitude was something I thought I'd enjoy. I'd spent plenty of time alone before, but that winter changed everything. My cabin was small and isolated, tucked just off the main road I plowed every morning. It had electricity, a small stove, and one tiny window facing the forest. I liked the view, trees weighed down with snow, everything muted and still, but sometimes the quiet felt too complete, like the world had gone dark and left me behind. I remember the first night vividly. I was sitting by the stove, the fire crackling, when I noticed tracks in the snow just beyond the treeline. I thought they were from a deer, maybe a fox. But as I looked closer, the spacing seemed wrong. Human-like, too long and uneven, like whoever had walked there hadn't been used to the snow. I brushed it off. Probably a hiker or another worker. Still, as I went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of my tiny window. Watching. Waiting. At first, the oddities were subtle. I'd hear branches snapping at strange angles, small thumps against the cabin walls, or the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow outside. But whenever I looked, there was nothing. I kept telling myself it was just the wind or an animal, but deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. One night, after a particularly long shift, I returned to the cabin to find the front door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it that morning. My stomach sank as I stepped inside, but nothing was moved, except for my boots. They were neatly placed by the stove, though I had left them scattered when I went to work. It was the kind of detail that made your blood run cold, because it meant someone had been inside while I wasn't there. The noises started to escalate too. Around 2 a.m., I'd hear slow footsteps pacing outside, circling the cabin. They weren't quick like an animal running. They were deliberate, careful, as if whoever it was trying not to make a sound, yet wanted to be noticed. Sometimes I'd hear a faint whisper, just on the edge of comprehension, like someone calling my name, but fading away before I could be sure. Then came the tracks. Fresh footprints appeared in the snow almost every morning, leading right up to my door and stopping abruptly. No return prints. No signs of a hiker or animal. Just the tracks waiting. I started keeping a baseball bat by the door, checking the locks repeatedly, and sleeping fully dressed. The forest, once comforting in its quiet, now felt like it was closing in. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like something breathing. By the end of that week, I realized I wasn't imagining it anymore. Someone or something was out there, and they were studying me, watching me, waiting, and I had no idea what would happen when they decided to make themselves known. The nights got worse. One evening, after finishing my shift, I noticed something strange as I approached the cabin. The snow around the porch was trampled in a way that hadn't been there earlier. Someone had walked there recently, but there was no way to tell where they came from. My heart started pounding as I quickly checked the locks, only to find one of the back windows slightly open. I was positive I had closed it that morning. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound, branches scraping the cabin, the wind whistling, made me jump. Around 1:30 a.m., I thought I saw a figure moving just outside the corner of my window. It was hunched and dark, blending into the forest shadows. When I turned on the flashlight, it was gone. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the fear in my chest wouldn't let me lie to myself anymore. By the third night, I was exhausted and paranoid. The footsteps outside grew louder, and sometimes I could hear them stop right under my window. Once, I heard a low, almost human sigh, like someone had been holding their breath, waiting for me to notice. Then the footprints started appearing closer. Not just around the cabin, but near the back door. They were too large to be mine, and the spacing was uneven, like the person outside was unsteady on the snow. I began keeping the lights on all night, pacing, listening, and waiting for something I didn't want to see. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and went outside, determined to catch whoever, or whatever, it was. The snow was deep, the air bitter, and my breath came out in ragged clouds. I stepped carefully, scanning the trees. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper just behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned slowly, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure retreat into the treeline, a dark shape with glowing eyes that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I ran back to the cabin, slamming the door and locking it behind me. By then, panic had fully taken hold. Whoever was out there wasn't going to leave, and I was starting to realize that I wasn't just being watched anymore. They were getting bolder. The night everything finally snapped was the coldest one yet. I remember waking up to the sound of something dragging across the porch. Slow, heavy, like someone pulling a limb through the snow. At first, I stayed frozen in bed listening. Then came the tapping. Not on the door. On the window right beside my head. 3 slow taps, then 2 more, and stood there in the dark, not daring to move closer. My breath felt loud in the stillness. The tapping stopped, replaced by a deep, rasping breath from the other side of the glass. I could hear it fogging up the window, long inhales, shaky exhales, like whoever was out there was right against it, inches from my face. I forced myself to pull back the curtain just an inch. What I saw didn't make sense. A face, pale, stretched, with eyes too wide, reflecting the moonlight like an animal's. The mouth hung open, lips cracked and frozen, as if the person had been out there for hours or days. The skin looked dead, but the eyes were alive, locked straight on mine. Before I could move, the thing lurched forward and slammed its entire body against the window. The glass spiderwebbed instantly. I stumbled back, dropping the bat, heart racing so hard I thought I'd pass out. The creature, or whatever it was, kept smashing its shoulder against the window, each hit louder than the one before. The frame groaned. Snow blew in through the cracks. That was all I needed. I grabbed my coat, didn't bother with boots, and bolted out the front door into the waist-deep snow. Behind me, I heard the window finally shatter. Then a sound I'll never forget, something dragging itself through the broken frame, slow but determined. I didn't look back. I ran barefoot through the snow, pain shooting up my legs, until I reached the main road. A plow truck was coming down the hill, lights blinding. I waved frantically, screaming until the driver stopped and pulled me in. By then, something was already emerging from the trees behind me, and it wasn't moving like a person anymore. The driver got me to town, and the sheriff came out to check the cabin the next morning. The place was a wreck. The window was completely smashed, the front door bent outward, and deep, strange scratches marked the walls. The snow around the cabin had prints, too large and uneven to be human, but they ended abruptly like whoever, or whatever, just vanished. No one ever found out what it was. The sheriff suggested an animal or a vagrant, but nothing matched what I had seen that night. Friends said I must have hallucinated, but I know what I saw. The face, the eyes. I'll never forget them. I never went back to that cabin. I quit the snowplow job and moved closer to town. But even now, whenever I drive past a frozen forest in winter, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching, waiting just behind the tree line. And sometimes, in the quiet of the cold nights, I swear I hear footsteps crunching in the snow, slow, deliberate, always following. I was 23 when this happened, working a seasonal job as a maintenance worker at a ski resort in Vermont. The resort wasn't busy yet, Just a handful of lodges open for the early snow, and most of the staff stayed on site in tiny cabins tucked away along the mountain trails. I liked the isolation at first. Quiet mornings, the smell of pine and snow, and the entire mountain to myself before the tourists arrived. My cabin was small, built against the slope of the mountain, with a single window facing the forest. At night, the world outside was silent and heavy, the kind of silence that feels almost alive. I remember the first week well, shoveling paths in the freezing cold, heating the cabin with an old wood stove, and feeling completely alone. But after the first week, I started noticing things. Boots I'd left at the door were moved. The firewood stacked outside was scattered in the snow. And late at night, when I tried to sleep, I'd hear faint noises coming from the forest. Not the usual creaks and groans of winter trees. Something softer. Something deliberate. The first time I heard it, I thought it was an animal. The second time, I wasn't so sure. And by the third night, I had a sinking feeling in my chest that I wasn't alone, and that whatever was out there, it was watching me. At first, I tried to ignore it. The noises were subtle, cracks in the snow, branches scraping against the cabin, or what I thought were animals moving in the distance. But it didn't take long for things to escalate. One night, after a long shift clearing the ski trails, I returned to the cabin to find the front door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. Inside, everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I double-checked the locks, slammed the door, and tried to convince myself it was just the wind. The real terror started a few nights later. I woke up to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. Not running, not panicked, just methodical, like someone was taking their time. My stomach sank, and I froze in bed, listening. Sometimes the steps stopped near the window, followed by a faint, rasping whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was human. I knew that much. Then came the footprints. Deep, wide prints appeared in the snow outside the cabin, leading right up to the door. No return tracks. Just a trail that ended abruptly, as if the person had vanished into thin air. Each morning, I found them in a different spot, closer, almost as if whoever, or whatever, was mapping my movements. I began staying awake most of the night, pacing the cabin, checking the locks repeatedly, gripping a crowbar whenever I heard the wind shift. Every shadow outside seemed alive. Every gust of wind felt like a presence brushing against the window. By the end of the week, I was terrified to sleep. The forest wasn't just dark anymore, it felt patient, waiting, and I knew deep down that sooner or later, it would make itself known. The nights got worse, faster than I ever expected. The sounds outside the cabin became harder to ignore. Branches snapping, heavy thuds against the walls, and the soft scraping of something moving in the snow. At first, I tried to convince myself it was wildlife, maybe a deer or fox, but the patterns didn't match. The steps were uneven, deliberate, almost mocking. One night, I woke to a sharp crack from the forest. I froze, listening. Then I heard a whisper, low and raspy, coming from just outside the cabin. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like it was saying my name. My chest tightened, and my hands went numb. I grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed toward the window, shining the beam into the darkness. For a brief second, I thought I saw movement, a hunched figure stepping between the trees, too smooth, too deliberate to be an animal. When I blinked, it was gone. By the fourth night, I started seeing the prints. They weren't just around the cabin anymore. They were closer to the back window, sometimes leading from the woods directly to the cabin wall. No return tracks, just the same heavy prints as if whoever, or whatever, was studying me, learning my routines. I tried to keep busy during the day, but the anticipation of night made my stomach churn. Every gust of wind, every creak of the roof, sounded like someone pacing outside. One evening, I stayed up for hours, clutching a crowbar, until I finally heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps crunching in the snow. They circled the cabin multiple times, then stopped just beneath the window I had been staring at. A long loci followed. Human, tired, almost pleading. I froze, knowing that if I looked, I might see something I couldn't unsee. The forest had stopped feeling like a place of trees and snow. It felt alive, patient, and aware of me. That night, for the first time, I realized I wasn't just being watched. That night without warning. I was being hunted. Snow fell so thick I could barely see my own hands in front of me, and the wind howled like the world itself was tearing apart. I was trapped in the cabin, fully aware that whatever had been circling me for days would take advantage of this. Around midnight, the power flickered and died. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only sound the howling wind outside. I gripped my crowbar and waited, heart hammering in my chest. That's when I heard it, a loud, deliberate thump against the front door, followed by another, then another. Heavy, each one shaking the frame. Then the window beside my bed rattled violently. I shined my weak flashlight toward it and froze. A dark, hunched figure pressed its face against the glass. Pale skin, wide eyes reflecting the moonlight, and a grin that made my stomach twist. I stumbled back as the figure slammed against the window, shattering the glass. Snow blew in, cold and sharp against my skin. I didn't think so. I grabbed my coat and boots and bolted through the back door, shoving through the deep snow, adrenaline propelling me forward. Behind me, the sound of the broken window splintering and heavy footsteps in the snow followed me. I ran blindly through the storm, branches whipping against my face, the wind nearly pushing me off balance. Somehow, I made it to the main road. Headlights appeared in the blizzard, and I waved desperately until a passing plow truck stopped. I jumped in, shivering uncontrollably, and we sped away. The storm swallowed the cabin behind us, and I dared not look back. Even now, I can't explain what I saw that night. But I know one thing, whatever it was waiting, and it knew exactly where I lived. I don't remember much after the plow truck drove me to the nearest town. The sheriff and a few deputies went to check the cabin the next morning. The place was a mess, the window completely destroyed, the door frame splintered, and snow piled deep inside from the storm. Outside, the prints in the snow didn't make sense. Too large to be human, uneven, and stopping abruptly as if whoever made them had vanished. No one ever found an explanation. The sheriff suggested an animal or some vagrant, but I know what I saw. The face at the window, the figure that followed me through the storm, I'll never forget it. I quit the job that same week and moved closer to town. I never went back to that cabin, not even to pack my things. But even now, when winter nights get especially quiet and the wind howls through the trees, I swear I hear footsteps in the snow. Slow, deliberate, just beyond sight. And sometimes, in the stillness, a faint whisper carries through the cold air, calling my name. I was 22 when this happened, working as a delivery driver for a small grocery store in northern Minnesota. Winter had already set in, and the roads were icy and treacherous. Most nights, I delivered to cabins and small homes tucked far into the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It was the kind of isolation that makes you feel both free and exposed at the same time. One evening, I had a delivery deep in the forest, to a cabin I'd never visited before. The directions were vague, and the GPS barely worked past a certain point. I remember driving slowly through narrow, snow-packed trails, my headlights cutting swaths through the heavy darkness. Everything was silent except for the crunch of my tires on the frozen road. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun disappeared behind the trees, the sky a dull gray-blue. No smoke from a chimney, no lights inside, just a lone cabin standing in the snow. Something about it made my stomach tighten, but I shrugged it off. I had deliveries to make, and people expected them, even in this weather. As I approached the door, I noticed strange tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks, human, but oddly spaced, leading around the cabin in loops. I brushed it off at first, but a creeping feeling told me I wasn't alone. And for the first time that day, I truly felt watched. At first, I tried to ignore it. Winter has a way of playing tricks on your senses. The wind whistles, branches scrape, snow shifts in ways that make you think someone is there. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It grew stronger the longer I stayed near the cabin. When I stepped onto the porch to leave the groceries, I noticed the tracks again. They weren't just around the cabin. They seemed to circle it, sometimes closer to the door, sometimes near the edge of the woods. Uneven, deliberate, like someone had been pacing, studying the cabin. I chalked it up to nerves, thinking maybe the homeowner had been moving outside earlier. But the deeper I looked, the more uneasy I felt. Inside the cabin, the air was thick, almost stale. I set the groceries on the counter, ready to leave quickly, when I noticed something strange. A chair that had been upright was now pushed back, and a small rug near the stove was slightly folded, like someone had stepped on it recently. My heart started racing. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd imagined it, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. That night, while driving away on the snowy trail, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. In the faint light of the snow-covered road, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, motionless, watching me. When I blinked, it was gone. By the next evening, I realized the tracks and strange movements weren't random. Whoever, or whatever, was there, they were waiting, and they knew exactly when I would return. The unease had grown into something heavier, like the forest itself had turned against me, pressing closer with every step. By the third night, panic had started to take hold. The tracks outside the cabin weren't just circling anymore. They were moving closer, sometimes stopping right beneath the windows. I kept a flashlight and a crowbar with me, pacing and listening, but the noises outside were maddeningly unpredictable. Sometimes it was slow crunching in the snow, sometimes a soft scraping, like someone dragging their hands along the walls of the cabin. One night, I woke to the faint sound of breathing, low, raspy, coming from the edge of the forest. I froze, straining to hear. It wasn't fast, not urgent, just steady and deliberate. My stomach sank as I realized the breaths were matching my own, as if someone, or something, was mirroring me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The footsteps outside became bolder. They circled the cabin repeatedly, sometimes stopping under a window or near the back door. Once, I heard a low, almost human sigh, like a whisper carried in the wind. I held my breath, heart hammering, praying it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Then came the scratches. Faint at first, small claw-like marks on the siding near the windows. By the next night, they were deeper, jagged, and closer to the door. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't hiding anymore. They were marking territory, letting me know I wasn't welcome, and that the cabin itself wasn't safe. One evening, I tried to confront it. I stepped onto the porch with the flashlight and shone it toward the treeline. For a brief second, I thought I saw movement, a hunched figure, dark against the snow, eyes reflecting faint light. When I blinked, it was gone. But the tracks had changed. They now led directly from the forest to the cabin door, stopping abruptly, as if the watcher had been waiting, slamming the door and wedging a chair under the handle. That night, sleep was impossible. The forest wasn't just outside anymore. It felt alive, like it was pressing against the cabin, watching, waiting. And I realized with cold certainty that whatever was out there wasn't going away. The storm came suddenly, a blizzard that buried the cabin in snow and made the forest around it unrecognizable. I was trapped inside, the wind shaking the walls and the temperature dropping so fast it felt like the air itself was trying to freeze me. I stayed huddled near the door with my crowbar, every nerve on edge. Around midnight, I heard it, a loud, heavy thump against the front door, followed by another. Then a scraping sound against the siding, moving slowly toward the window. I shined my flashlight through the glass and froze. A figure crouched just outside the window, pale, hunched, impossibly still, with eyes glinting in the dim light. Its face was slack, almost expressionless, but the gaze was locked on me, and I could feel it pressing into my chest through the glass. Before I could react, it slammed its body against the window. The glass cracked violently. I stumbled back, dropping the crowbar, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it would burst. Snow blew in through the shattered glass, icy and sharp against my skin. I didn't think so. I grabbed my boots, shoved them on, and bolted through the back door into the storm. Snow was waist deep, and the wind nearly knocked me off my feet, but I ran blindly, guided only by the faint glow of distant lights from the main road. Behind me, the broken window rattled, and heavy footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow. I finally made it to the road, waving down a passing plow truck. The driver pulled me in, and I collapsed, shivering uncontrollably. Somewhere behind me, in the storm, the cabin disappeared into the blizzard, and I didn't dare look back. Even now, I can't explain exactly what I saw that night. But I know one thing, it was waiting, and it knew where I lived. I don't remember much after the plow truck dropped me off in town. The sheriff came the next morning to inspect the cabin. The place was a wreck, the broken window, the splintered door frame, and snow piled inside. The tracks outside made no sense. Too large to be human, uneven, and stopping suddenly, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. No one ever offered a real explanation. The sheriff suggested an animal or a transient, but I know what I saw. The figure, the eyes, the way it moved, it wasn't normal. I quit the delivery job the same week and never went back to that forest. I moved closer to town and avoided roads that led deep into the woods. Even now, on quiet winter nights, I still hear faint footsteps in the snow outside my window. Slow, deliberate, circling as if it's waiting for me to slip up. Sometimes, I swear I hear a faint whisper carried by the wind, soft and deliberate, saying my name. And I know somewhere out there, it hasn't forgotten me. I was 25, working as a night security guard at a remote mountain lodge in upstate New York. The lodge sat at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by miles of snow-covered trails and frozen streams. Winters there were brutal, the kind where the snowdrifts bury cars, and the wind can cut through even the thickest jacket. I took the job for the solitude and extra cash, thinking it would be peaceful. The lodge itself was quiet at night, mostly empty except for the occasional late guest. My routine was simple: rounds every hour, monitor the cameras, and keep an eye on the property. Most nights were boring. The kind of nights where the only sounds are the wind whistling past the building and the creaks of the old wood settling under the weight of the snow. But then one night, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. A set of footprints appeared in the fresh snow outside the lodge entrance. Human-shaped, large, but oddly spaced and heading toward the forest, not away from the building. I assumed it was a guest wandering off or maybe a hiker, but as I watched from the security camera, I saw the prints stop in the middle of the trail. No one was there. I shrugged it off at first. Winter can play tricks on your mind. But by the third night, I realized something was lurking just beyond the lodge, watching, waiting, and I had no idea what it wanted. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Footprints in the snow, strange noises, probably a guest, a hiker, or an animal. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It grew heavier each night. The first odd thing I noticed was movement near the treeline. From the security cameras, I saw shadows shifting between the trees, too tall and deliberate to be wildlife. Sometimes it would vanish the moment I looked closer, as if it knew I was watching. Other times, I heard faint scratching at the building's siding, like nails dragging slowly across wood. One night, after completing my rounds, I stepped outside to check the perimeter. The snow was undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading up to the back door. They stopped there. No return prints. No sign of anyone leaving. My stomach turned as I realized the tracks hadn't been there when I did my earlier rounds. Inside, the lodge didn't feel safe either. Doors I knew were locked were slightly ajar. The chairs were shifted. Small items I hadn't touched were out of place. At first, I questioned my memory, thinking exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But the sensation of being watched was too real, pressing down on me like the cold outside. By the third night, the whispers started. Soft, low, unintelligible words carried on the wind, coming from the forest just beyond the lodge. I froze every time, convinced that someone, or something, was calling my name. The footprints, the sounds, the whispers, it all pointed to one chilling fact. Whatever was out there, it knew me. By the end of the week, I stopped going outside alone. Every shadow seemed alive, every gust of wind sounded like breathing, and the lodge, once a place of work and quiet, had become a trap. By the fourth night, panic had set in. The footsteps outside were no longer sporadic. They circled the lodge relentlessly, sometimes slow and deliberate, other times quick and light, vanishing as suddenly as they appeared. I kept the security cameras on constantly, but every time I looked, the forest beyond the lodge seemed empty. And yet, the sounds didn't stop. One night, while making my rounds, I saw something move near the treeline. A dark, hunched figure, barely visible in the snow and shadows, paused as if studying me. I froze, holding my flashlight tight. The figure didn't run. It just stood there, motionless, before vanishing into the dense trees. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footprints became more erratic, deep impressions leading directly to the lodge doors, then stopping as if whoever, or whatever, was out there had vanished into thin air. Occasionally, the marks would reappear, closer, sharper, almost daring me to notice. Then came the whispers. At first, they were soft, distant. But night after night, they grew closer, sharper, like someone speaking right behind the walls. I could swear I heard my name, drawn out, slow, and deliberate. One night, I finally snapped. I grabbed my crowbar and stepped outside into the snowstorm, determined to see what was out there. The wind ripped at my coat and whipped snow into my face. I scanned the forest, flashlight shaking, and there it was, a figure crouched between two trees, impossibly still, staring at me. Pale, hunched, eyes reflecting the dim light, its breath misting in the cold air. When I moved, it moved too, always keeping just the door. Every step it made outside echoed through the snow, deliberate, patient. I realized then that I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. And the forest, the lodge, even the snow itself seemed to be in on it. The storm that night was relentless. Snow whipped across the lodge, cutting visibility to almost nothing, and the wind shook the building as if trying to tear it apart. I stayed huddled near the main entrance, crowbar in hand, every nerve on edge. Around midnight, a loud, heavy thump echoed from the side door. Then another, and another. The sounds were slow and deliberate, each one shaking the frame of the building. My heart felt like it would explode in my chest. Then I heard it at the windows, a scraping like claws across the glass. I shined my flashlight, and my blood ran cold. A figure crouched against the window, pale and hunched, eyes wide, reflecting the dim light. Its mouth opened slightly, frozen in an impossible expression. Before I could react, it slammed its shoulder into the window. The glass cracked violently. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. Snow and shards of glass blew inside, cold and sharp against my skin. I didn't think so. I grabbed my coat and boots and bolted out the back door into the storm. The snow was waist deep, the wind nearly knocking me off balance, but adrenaline carried me forward. Behind me, the sounds of breaking glass and heavy footsteps followed, slow and relentless, crunching through the snow. I finally reached the main road, waving desperately at a plow truck. The driver stopped and pulled me in. I collapsed into the seat, shaking uncontrollably, my lungs burning from the cold and panic. Somewhere behind me, in the blizzard, the lodge disappeared into the storm, swallowed by the forest. I didn't look back. Even now, I can't explain exactly what I saw that night. But I know this, whatever it was patient, and it knew exactly where I lived. The next morning, the sheriff came to inspect the lodge. The building was a wreck, broken glass, splintered siding, and snow piled inside. Outside, the footprints didn't make sense. Too large to be human, uneven, and stopping abruptly as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. No one ever offered a real explanation. The sheriff suggested an animal or a trespasser, but I know what I saw. The figure at the window, the way it moved through the snow, it wasn't normal. I quit the job that week and never returned to that part of the forest. I moved closer to town and avoided roads that led deep into the woods. But even now, on quiet winter nights, I still hear the crunch of snow outside my window. Slow, deliberate, circling, as if it's waiting for me to slip up. Sometimes, carried on the wind, I hear a faint whisper, soft, deliberate, and unmistakably calling my name. And I know somewhere out there, it hasn't forgotten me.